All right, Enter Squad. Today we're going to look at aggregate demand and aggregate supply. What are those? What do they look like? And how do we graph them? Aggregate means all. So we are in macroeconomics. We're studying the big picture, the big pie, the total enchilada, our overall economy. So we're going to be measuring in aggregates, which is total numbers. When we say aggregate supply, we mean all of the supply in the economy. How do economists measure aggregate supply? They measure it through certain indicators. So measurements like manufacturing. How much is being supplied? How much is being made in our economy? Aggregate demand means all of the demand in our economy. Indicators that measure aggregate demand are unemployment. If unemployment is high, we're going to have low aggregate demand because people will have less money to spend. Other indicators that help economists determine aggregate demand are things like durable goods sales and non-durable goods sales. How much are we spending? What is the level of demand? And as you learned earlier, durable goods sales really are a good indication of consumer confidence. As the more confident we are, the more we're going to spend on those big ticket items. All right, as you can see from the graph, it does look very similar to demand and supply from microeconomics, where we looked at individual consumers and individual producers. Aggregate supply still shifts from still slopes up from left to right, and demand still slopes downward from left to right. What's different is on the horizontal axis, instead of quantity supplied or quantity demand, we have GDP. And on the vertical axis, we still have price. So aggregate demand and aggregate supply definitely together can affect the overall price or the overall dollars in our economy. And when those 2 points shift, they have an impact on GDP. All right, this point in the middle is equilibrium. That's the price at which aggregate demand and aggregate supply meet. Now, we are going to look at how does shifts in aggregate demand and aggregate supply affect GDP and affect price. Let's say that aggregate supply decreases. So that will be AS2. Aggregate supply decreases. I'm going to say that's our current situation. Our supply has decreased due to the coronavirus. The supply chain first was interrupted in China. As China went on lockdown, workers could not go to factories, they could not work, they could not build things. Eventually that moved to Europe and now to the United States. Our supply, our total supply, has decreased. Also, at the same time, aggregate demand has also decreased as more and more people are getting laid off, are quarantined, not going to work, are nervous about their financial future. Aggregate demand has decreased. So, when aggregate supply decreases and aggregate demand decreases, price stays the same. So we can expect prices to remain steady in this recession. But when aggregate supply and aggregate demand decreased, it definitely had an effect on GDP. What happens to GDP when both supply and demand go down? So does GDP.